email to say, hello, we don't know one another. Would you do this? And I immediately said, glad to. So I want to thank Nantucket Athenaeum. I also want to thank Nantucket Historical Association, where I've been doing great research all week. And I suppose I need to thank RIT for a sabbatical that made it possible for me to be here in April and not about to head into finals week, I think. So it all came together. I am taking us back to the Nantucket of 200 years ago, roughly. So my work is in the early 19th century. And I'm interested in deaf Nantucketers, all of whom were among that first generation of deaf people to ever go to school in this country. And they all attended the same school, the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, which opened actually in April of 1817, which is why April is Deaf History Month. So there are several deaf Nantucketers who go to the school in that early period. We do not have time to talk about all of them in depth today, but I'll just rattle out their names so I can satisfy myself that I introduced them. They were in chronological order of their attendance: Charles Hiller, Phoebe Allen, Lucretia Barnard, Albert Barnard, Anna Barnard, Catherine Trenton Robinson, and then Lucretia Kent Barnard, who was Albert's daughter, who attended in his footsteps. I want to focus on the Barnard siblings. They may have noticed they all have the same name there. Their parents were Benjamin and Anna Barnard, and they had the following children. This is every year. So I'm going to start with the oldest down to the youngest, and she pretty much had a baby every year. I don't understand. They were Lucretia was the oldest, and then Sarah, Thomas, Phoebe, Elizabeth, Anna, Albert, and finally Martha. So they have 8 children altogether, 3 of whom are deaf, 5 of whom are hearing. It seems likely that this Barnard family traces its roots back to the Barnards of Martha's Vineyard, which would make sense because those families carried a genetic strain of deafness. And now here we see 3 deaf children in the same family. So that's my current working theory anyway. Lucretia goes to the school first. She attends from 1826 until 1831. She is only the 222nd student to ever enroll. So we're not only far back in Nantucket's history, we're really early history of deaf people ever getting an education. So she's a pioneer here. Albert follows her in 1832. He remains until 1839, and then his sister Anna comes with him the following year in 1833, and she just stays with him the whole time until 1839. The school, for people who don't know, beyond that it opened in 1817 in Hartford, was founded by 2 educators together. One was an American named Thomas Gallaudet, and the other is a deaf Frenchman named Laurent Clair. So it's this great hearing deaf partnership that makes the school come to life. It would have been unusual to have so many deaf siblings in one family. The majority of deaf students who attended the school in these years came alone. And a lot of them had never met another deaf person. So you see all of these really sad letters from them at first, where they are asked to describe their life before they came to school. And a lot of those people just write, I thought I was the only deaf person in the world. And then I came to school and I walked in and there's all these deaf people. I had no idea. So the Barnards are interesting because they're not in that camp, right? They know there's other deaf people. They know they exist. And they get to come, well, Albert and Anna, everybody get to come together as a, excuse me, as a pair. I have been really interested in how they managed to get there, which has really been giving me fits. I just couldn't imagine what it was like here in the 1830s to go to the Hartford from Nantucket. So Lucretia herself, luckily, tells us how it was done. So in 1830, she decided to write a short essay about her travels. So she described getting on a boat in Hartford, which of course sits on the Connecticut River, taking the boat first to Middletown, and then picking up another boat in Middletown, which carried on to Saybrook, Connecticut, which is on the coast. Now they arrive in Saybrook on a Monday afternoon on this particular trip in 1830. She then writes, I'll leave it to her, about 4 o'clock in the morning, some people and myself continued to sail in a vessel for Nantucket the whole day and night. On Wednesday morning, I was very much enjoyed to arrive at Nantucket in safety. I'm going to think about that when I'm like moaning about how long the high-speed ferry is taking. It's like, check yourself. It took her a day and a night to get there. She was met by her uncle and her father, and she talks about meeting them. My uncle came to the cabin. I shook him by the hands. I was very glad to see him. A little while, my father entered the cabin. I embraced him and he wept. I was very glad to see him. I was happy to talk with him by my small slate. We arrived at home. My mother was very much delighted to embrace me, and my sisters also kissed me. I was tired. Yeah, no kidding, Lucretia. My neighbors heard that I arrived at home. They came home, and they seemed to be very happy to shake me by the hands. I was much delighted to stay home for 4 weeks. I was often visited by my relations who were happy to converse with me by my small slate every day. So there's tons of things to love about that story. One is this personal communication device she keeps talking about, which was her small slate. So a lot of deaf people took to carrying like literally a small slate. Probably my notes here are full sheet. They're about half size in a wooden frame, and they would carry a piece of chalk. But that also means you have to be literate to be able to use the small slate. So that goes back to the point of why the school is so important, because now she can write to them. It also only works if the people you're writing to have an education and know how to read. So widespread literacy in America also is helping deaf people in this time period. Interesting twist for her here is that it's not just that she's gaining English, she's gaining access to American Sign Language. And then she's bringing American Sign Language home to her deaf siblings who haven't yet left for school, which means that Albert and Anna had some knowledge, working knowledge of ASL before they even got deaf education themselves directly. And it also makes the Barnards kind of key figures in how ASL develops even as a language in this period. And then finally, when Lucretia said that she was glad to be home, we should know that she was right here. The Barnard home was across the street from the Athenaeum. So they were neighbors with you. So this is 1830. She completes school then in 1831, and then Albert goes off to school in 1832. I will talk about Albert eventually, but I'm just using him for a minute here to introduce somebody else. Albert went to school with a deaf woman from New Bedford, whose name was Lydia Macomber. Lydia learned actually from Albert that he had an older sister. Lydia's time had not overlapped with Lucretia's. He was like, hey, I have a sister your age, and maybe you guys should get to meet one another. So Lydia hears that Lucretia is interested in meeting her. She finds out through the grapevine, the deaf grapevine, quotes, that Lucretia often thought of writing to me, though she has never before seen me. And she said she frequently thought to make an attempt to go to New Bedford to see her cousins, and then she would be happy to see me. So Lydia gave her thumbs up to that plan, and the two young women finally meet, and they also continue this letter correspondence through the early 1830s. This, in and of itself, for me as a historian, would make a great story right there, because it's really sweet how deaf education is doing all this in her life. She's getting sign language, she's getting English, she can communicate with her family now, and now she can make more deaf friends out in the great big world. But it gets a lot better. In a letter, one of Lydia's letters, in 1837, Lydia's writing to another deaf woman, and she finally tells this amazing story. Last 7th month, L. Barnard said she left Hartford and went to Nantucket, and she has been to the Athenaeum and seen Mariah. As she wanted LB to go and see her, Mariah talked with her by fingers, and she was surprised to see that Mariah could spell. Mariah then told her that I taught her how to spell the letters. So this, of course, is Mariah Mitchell, who had just started, of course, working here in the Athenaeum in 1836. It turns out Mariah and Lydia were friends. Turns out Lydia was also friends with Mariah's sister, Anne, and it turns out this is all because at this time, this particular moment, Lydia has really good timing here. Mariah is still a Quaker, and so are Lydia's family. And so Lydia has been coming regularly to Nantucket in order to attend the Quaker quarterly meetings. And when Lydia would come with her family, they would actually board with the Mitchells. So she had gotten to know Mariah there, and then Mariah had decided that she needed to learn how to spell, that is, how to finger spell. So this is, of course, the manual alphabet. Now I'm going to screw it up. No. E-G-S-T-U-V-W-X-Y-N-Z. And so she doesn't sign, but she can spell. But Lucretia was like, what? When she walked in, and Mariah now effectively was showing off, right? Oh yeah, I want her to come and see me because I want to be able to show her what I learned. So it turns out now all of these young women know one another, and Mariah can actually communicate with them directly, and they don't have to spell on the small slate. They can just communicate directly. Finally, in 1838, Lydia came back to Nantucket for another Quaker meeting and went to Lucretia's house, of course, across the street, with the Mitchell girls in tow. They arrive and then discover, to their disappointment, that Lucretia's not there. She was still in Hartford at school. And so instead, they hung out first with Lucretia's mom. And then Mariah told her we should go to see the Athenaeum. And so they came across the street. As Lydia remembers it, we went to the Athenaeum, which is opposite to Lucretia's house, to see it, and I was filled with great wonder. Yep, same, Lydia, same. Back to Albert, because he has his own story here that I hijacked in order to bring in Mariah. Albert finishes up at the American School in 1839. The 1840 census, he does come home here. This is one of the things I was trying to track down, actually this afternoon. Finally found him in the census here for 1840. He's 16 years old. In 1845, he makes the very bold decision and joins the crew of a whaling ship, the whaling ship Japan, which leaves Nantucket in September of 1845 with Captain Valentine Starbuck Riddle. Albert signs on as the ship's cooper. As far as I know, he is the only deaf man to serve aboard a whaling ship. So when I found, and again, it's thanks to Nantucket Historical Association, they had a document come in over the transom to them, and Michael Harrison reached out to me and said, you will want to know this. I'm the one who then said, and I think he's the only deaf man to serve, because the secondary literature as it stands right now tells us that deaf men didn't go into whaling. Surprise. So there's Albert. They sailed to the Pacific. They return with nearly 1,200 barrels of sperm oil, so it's a successful voyage. I have no idea how he functioned. I have no idea how he communicated with anybody else on board. This is all the to be determined. I don't know. Fascinating. He was lucky on this trip, I know, because the first officer actually dies on this voyage. So that's a good thing for Albert. He makes it home. But he's also incredibly unlucky. Because remember, he leaves in September of 1845. He doesn't return here to Nantucket until May of 1849. So all these things happened while he was away whaling. One, the Great Fire of 1846 happened, which of course would have burned down his house because it was across the street from here, and this original Athenaeum burned as well. So, and you walk back and your town is basically gone. So, and your house is gone. So that happened. Then he walks home to discover his sister Anna has died of consumption. She dies in June of 1847. She was only 26 years old. Then he also finds out while he was away that his mother died in June of 1848 at the age of 62. So I can only imagine this guy's 20 years old. He leaves to go whaling. He thinks this is a great adventure. And he comes back, his family is dead and his house is gone. It's just, I can't even imagine. Perhaps completely unsurprisingly, Albert quickly decided to get back on the road and just leave. This was no place left for him. So he headed to California immediately for the gold rush. He was there For that, he's covered in the newspapers here in Nantucket as they're listing all the men who've gone off to the gold rush. His name appears in the Inquirer in December of 1849. He's back east by 1850. He's recorded in the census living and working in New Hampshire. In fact, he's living in Amherst, New Hampshire, which is where his sister Lucretia is now living. She, while he was away, had gotten married. She married a deaf man named George Kent, and they moved to Amherst, and they live in Amherst for the rest of their lives. Albert then gets married himself in a ceremony held in Lucretia's house to a deaf woman named Rhoda Edson in May of 1851. They seem to have stayed initially in New Hampshire together, and then the 1860 census shows them in Charleston, Massachusetts. In 1864, he appears suddenly living in San Francisco, but his sister Phoebe was also living out in San Francisco at this time with her husband, Henry. So he had family connections that let him go out there. But then in 1868, he's back on the East Coast. He's working in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where he seems to have stayed, he and his wife. He will die there of heart disease in 1875. So I was curious, like, what we make of that, like, in terms of his life, does this mean he's a success or a failure, right? Does he keep moving around because he keeps wiping out, right, of every job that he has, and so he just moves on to the next thing? Or is he able to make all these moves because he has the skills to move? So if he feels like, well, this job isn't working for me, I can go get another one. All of those jobs, when he keeps bopping around, are all jobs that involve carpentry of some kind or another. And carpentry is a trade he would have been taught at the American School for the Deaf. So because he was deaf, he got that education, and then he had those skills, and then that enabled him just to keep on rolling when he wanted something new to do. But in his case, it's where the Nantucket part of the story really shines. He also had the connections as a Nantucketer. He had family that had moved around. He could move to where family was. He could know that there was a little bit of a support system waiting for him. And then I would also suggest, finally, and I only just found out again this week while I was here, that he had been on a whaling ship, that he also, I think, benefited by being a Nantucketer because he wasn't intimidated by that. With the notion of moving a long distance, and even as far as California, he would have thought, sure, fine, why not do that? Whereas a lot of people would have found that, I think, a lot more intimidating. As I said, I don't want to talk about all the Nantucketers because I think that's a lot of people. And these three are particularly allowing us, I think, to get great insight into what it was like to have been deaf in this early period. And I had no idea before I came here that the Barnards were right here, right across the street from y'all. So that seems like a wonderful juxtaposition and a happy coincidence for us to end with. I thank you for your time and attention this evening. I really appreciate it.
Are there any questions from folks in the audience? I do have a question, and I feel like I can hold you hostage because it's my event too. So in your research, have you focused primarily on Nantucket, or have you also drawn comparisons, say, to because I know, and I've worked at the Historical Association as a tour guide for 3.5 years before transitioning here. But I am aware that there is a deaf population on the vineyard, a historical deaf population on the vineyard. And I just was curious if you have delved into that, what parallels, do you see any parallels? Are there differences? What are those differences? Just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I have done research on the vineyard community, and I have written about them too. They're two actually really distinct communities. The vineyard community is a lot bigger, for one, than this group. So that's, I think, a big distinction. But I also think that there are certain parallels. That is, you start to see a real pattern with the vineyard deaf as the 19th century goes on. And that pattern is you have most of them who, it's about 20 people all told. Actually, that might not be true. Don't quote me. 25 who go to the American school. right? And when you look at that body, most typically it's the deaf men who come back home to Martha's Vineyard. And that's typically because they inherited something, worked some land, right? They go home. The women tend to marry a deaf man from the mainland, and then they stay on the mainland. And we see the Nantucketers in this small sample doing that too, right? They leave and they go. They don't stay. And so we see that a little bit of that playing out in the vineyard. And I think it's also because deaf education for both of these populations on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard actually allowed them to be plugged into a bigger network on the mainland. And they liked that. And this is particularly a point when deaf community on the mainland is starting to come together. And so they want to be a part of that. And so you see a little bit of voting with their feet. I think both for the Vineyarders and for our Nantucketers as well. But that's my early going speculation, we'll say.
Anybody else have a question?
Thank you. So thanks for your talk. That was really fascinating. I was wondering about whaling ship logs in
Yeah, no
kind of
kidding.
corroborating the
Yeah.
story of your Cooper whaler. And I'm just curious if you've been able to locate anything.
Yeah, so again, this had just sort of come to attention.
Yeah.
This existed. And so I haven't seen the full log, but it came to the attention of Nantucket Historical Association because someone's trying to sell the log. And so they actually were not interested in Albert. They contacted Nantucket Historical because Valentine Starbuck Riddle was from Nantucket and he was a whaling captain from Nantucket.
Right.
And so they were like, oh, Nantucket, whaling, Nantucket. So I already told Michael, you can't tell them Albert's a big deal because I don't know if they're interested in this artifact or not, but they find out what they actually have, that's not good for buyers, right? But they showed basically the higher up the officers list. So I haven't seen a list of everyone who was on board yet because they didn't include that.
Yeah.
They just had a list of the officers. They'd taken a screenshot basically of this log. And so it starts with captain and then first mate, second mate, third mate. And Albert is the last person listed. And it just says Albert Barnard, Cooper, open paren, deaf and dumb, close paren. So they even wrote it in the
Interesting.
in the log. I about killed over when the photo came through to me. I'm told it might be possible to get eyes on the actual log. Yes, and so this is now the focal point of my life right now. It would be, but it's not actually here. Just the tantalizing, this is out there, made its way to here, but not the full log itself. Oh, I know. Me too. I hope so. And I hope it does all those things too. I really hope that. Yeah. I had no idea when that he had done that. And literally until this week, I think I found out Tuesday.
I mean, it certainly wasn't Nantucket deaf people.
Right, right. No, fair enough. No, I have researched deaf history for a long time in New England. But followed the foundation of the school. I was particularly interested in how the foundation of the school formed kind of accidentally the deaf community. I mean, accidentally by which I mean, when Thomas Gallaudet and Laurent Claire founding the school, they are not thinking, and thus we create deaf culture. I mean, they're just thinking we're providing education, right? And so it's this inadvertent coincidence, right? That like literally because of that, this is how come when you watch the Super Bowl in February, they have deaf people who are signing the national anthem. Like it's a direct line, like because this happened, that's why we see that in our culture right now. So I grew up in Connecticut, and of course, Connecticut is where the school was founded. And it's not often you get a state event, right, that then has this huge national implication. It's not often you have a state event where you can literally point to a place on a map and go, a language was born here, in American Sign Language. And yet we never talked about it. You know, when I was growing up, because when I was growing up, nobody cared, bluntly. I mean, you know, no one was interested in deaf history. It is still there. The American School is still there. It's still open, still serving deaf students from Connecticut. And so I more or less became really interested in it as a focus of my research studies, because I just thought, well, this is like a fabulous story, and why doesn't anybody know it's a great story, and why don't we ever talk about it, right? So through that, I kind of backed my way in, to answer your question, into some of these other people when I would find them, right? And I go, oh, wait, I didn't realize, oh, over here, oh, over there, this kind of thing. I did for many years, actually. I taught, it was very weird. No, it was good. No, it was really good. It was also it's a little bit weird because I am obviously a hearing person. I signed, but not enough to sign for myself in a lecture, because that's just not fair to deaf students. Like I can sign with them if they just pop up to my lectern and we, you know, chat. But for a lecture, it's not fair because they don't want me stumbling through, and they need someone who's fluent. So I work with interpreters. But when I used to teach it and walk in on the first day, there'd be this whole, what are you doing here? Because you're a hearing person. And so like that first day of class, we'd have to have this, like literally the whole class is me talking about my background, why I do what I do, why I find it interesting, and what I can do and what I can't do. Like, in other words, like I have absolutely no idea what it's like to be a deaf person, and I'm never going to know what it's like to be a deaf person. But I actually do know what it was like to be a deaf person in 1830, right? Like that's what, you know, like I do know that. And then that lets most of the deaf people in the room go, oh, I don't know anything about that. And I'm like, oh, okay, there we go. So that's how we sort of meet in the middle, so to speak. But this is like the story of my life, though, because one of the other classes I teach at RIT is the history of baseball. And in that class, when I walk in for the first time, I get a lot of, oh my God, it's a girl. We are doomed. Right. So that's right. So then we have to have like a whole, okay, surprise. Yeah. So yeah, apparently this is, now that I hear myself say that, apparently this is just what I do. I just pick. Yes. In fact, I wrote a whole book on that. So yes, I wrote a book on them too.
What did you just say? I missed that. Are there any? Is there deaf?
There were many deaf, there's been a lot of deaf players who came through the minors. Everybody, like, you know, a certain point in US history, like circa, I don't know, 1880 to like 1910, every man with athletic talent is either boxing or playing baseball, right? So that's kind of what you do. There's a lot of deaf players that you see in state leagues and stuff like that. I was really interested in those who broke through to the majors and who played Major League Baseball. And there's been 5, 6, 7 of those. So yeah, I wrote a book about them. That was good times. That was like bringing things together, baseball and deafness.
Kind of bouncing off of what you had mentioned with Albert, which I mean, that's just a wild story, and
Yeah.
picture the day to day. Like you could have like a whole independent film just about him going out to sea on a whaling ship for 7 years, like traveling the world.
I know.
Amazing. And I'm again comparing and contrasting in your research with Martha's Vineyard's deaf population, which obviously had a little bit of a different experience than, because my understanding is there's hereditary deafness. They were developing a sort of colloquial sign language where everyone on the island could, everyone on the island could speak or sign
Yep.
something. And so there weren't these hurdles, right?
Right.
So I'm just curious, like, your insights onto the daily life of, say, like,
Yeah.
made me think of like what it would be like for a sailor from Martha's Vineyard, or
Right.
around that time period. Would you imagine there being significant hurdles? I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
having to deal with healing people, but having a whole island that understands you is.
Oh my God. Yeah. No, I just think it's a huge difference sort of experientially. And clearly that the Barnards don't have that here. Like people on Nantucket do not know sign language, and there is no existing kind of just Nantucket sign in the way that there is a Martha's, or was a Martha's Vineyard sign language, right? So they would not have had that experience here at all. Like their deafness would have been more of a big social barrier, even here. I am now, since I found this out just like 3 days ago, obsessed with this question of how Albert functioned on a whaling ship as the only deaf person for 4 years. I don't even know. So that's one of the things how did he communicate with those people? I don't know. I know that the Vineyarders, because there are no deaf men there who go out whaling. That's part of where this story that deaf men didn't go into that kind of originated from. But I think it's understandable because the biggest population we had that was involved in the maritime economy were vineyard deaf men. And yes, none of them ever go out whaling. They do a lot of fishing, but around, the more what we would think of as local waters, right? And they communicate very well with everybody on boat and on shore because they just all sign to each other. So it also becomes like I don't want to, it's fascinating and interesting and really cool, but it doesn't answer a lot of questions. Like, well, of course you all got along on the boat because you all could communicate and sign with each other, right? You know what I mean? But if you take that away, then what are we doing? Albert, actually, this gives us a chance to go, yeah, what are we doing? How did that actually work? Actually, right? So yeah, I'm like,
Got a new question to keep yourself up at night, that's for sure.
yes. So I was like excited to talk about this, but I felt a little bad because it's like not even half baked. It's like not baked. It's just like you catch like historian just in total process with this.
These children's parents,
No, so the other thing with all of these people, all of the Nantucketers, all of them have hearing parents. So even for like Benjamin and Anna, they suddenly have 3 deaf kids, right? Here's their firstborn daughter, and it turns out she's deaf, right? So they must think, what? But then their next few kids are hearing, like, okay. But then they have 2 deaf kids in a row, Albert and then Anna. Yeah, they probably didn't know anything about. That's such a great question. I freaking wonder about that all the time. I think it seems like there were several things that happened. The school did quite a bit of its own self-publicity. And if you've seen 19th century newspapers, you get all those columns of nothing but ads and announcements. And so I think there was some of that. The particular thing that happened between Massachusetts and the Hartford school, which definitely I know for a fact helped the Barnards, is that Massachusetts basically decided after the American school opened that it did not need to open its own school for deaf kids because that would just be a duplicative. So instead, they said to the American school, hey, could we send our deaf students to you? We will pay the tuition. The state will pay the tuition. Yeah, and so that is clearly what, especially by the 1830s, by the time Albert and Anna go, they've worked out the details of how that's going to work state to state, all the transfers and the money equation. And both of them clearly get state tuition to attend. And so then there's no barrier for the hearing parents to think, oh, I've got to pay for this kid to go to school and it's right. No, you don't have to pay anything. The state's going to take care of it. And then the parents go, yay, because now my child can get an education, which they would not have been able to do otherwise. Yeah. Same. So the Vineyard children go there, and actually that is what kind of inadvertently leads to the eventual death of Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. It's that on the Vineyard, before the school opens, because there were so many deaf people, the Vineyard had its own very local language, which we still refer to as Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, and the deaf people signed it, and probably a good number of the hearing residents signed it as well. That language actually starts to die because the Vineyard deaf go to Hartford, and then they learn American Sign Language with their mainland peers, and they use the mainland's language, right? And then they start bringing those signs back to the Vineyard, and then slowly over time, yeah, the Vineyard language as its own goes extinct. Yeah. Sort of like, that's like unintended consequences, right? You don't think, well, we'll get education and kill a language, and like that wasn't the plan. But it's looking more and more to historical linguists who have studied this, that's probably actually what happened to the Vineyard Sign Language.
Are there any, so for folks that are like just delving into deaf history, are there any riveting reads or, authors that you recommend that would be a good first leap into exploring deaf history?
Yeah, great question. Like the quick and dirty overview is a short book, which is why it's nice. It's really short. It's very quick, but it's a nice panorama. Is a classic from the '80s called "A Place of Their Own," and it's the subtitle is something like "Creating the Deaf Community in America," and so it just kind of takes you on a tour. From the founding of the American school and then kind of what happens to the community from there. So that's like my go-to for quick overview book. That book is old, but I just love that book. Douglas Bayton has a book called Forbidden Signs, which is about how American culture starts to attack American Sign Language. So the American school only taught using sign language, but then there'll be a challenge in the late 19th century where Americans will start freaking out that deaf people are becoming like foreigners and everybody hates them. So we need to make deaf people talk so they'll fit in. And so they want to turn all the education into what becomes known as oralism, that is teaching deaf people only how to talk. So none of the people I'm talking about here went through that because they're all going to school when it's only sign language, and no one's even thought about doing that yet. So I like this period a lot better. And I leave it to Doug. And he, has a great book on why that falls apart and why oralism rises. And so that is a book that came out in the 90s, and actually now with sort of current politics and questions around immigration and migration, I picked it up again recently and was a little disturbed at how resonant it was still after so many years. And then if you find this as obsessively interesting as I do, I can plug my new book actually, which is called Ordinary Lives, which I wrote with my co-author Eric Nystrom. And we use the census of 1880 to particularly try to get to ordinary people. Like, this is partly how come I even got into Lucretia Barnard and Albert and Anna in the first place. How can we find ordinary people, not just the ones who become kind of famous in the deaf community, but just ordinary people, and how did they live in the 19th century? So, and that's a particularly focus on Massachusetts too, because Eric had mad skills to find the Massachusetts data particularly, and then he just send me names. You go, who's this? Who's that? Who's that? Oh. It's fun. Yes, correct. that was a part of the appeal of using Massachusetts as one of our baselines. So the book tries to do, it's trying to do two things at once. So Eric is the digital historian. He does digital humanities stuff. And he was able to find big census databases and query them. So to find out from like a macro level, right? Here we are in 1880 across the country, where are most deaf people living, right? Do we notice any patterns? What age overall, right, nationwide, are deaf people getting married? And then what age we're hearing people getting married? So can we notice how their lives are different from their peers, or are they the same? How many kids do they have? What kind of jobs do they have? So he just churned at the big macro level, but like a whole book that's just statistics, nobody wants it. Right. So, I mean, they're interesting for a while, but then you need a break. So I was the person who was like providing the break. And so he focused on Massachusetts because those records are really rich, digitally available, and made them more accessible to me. And then so we go from sort of the big overview nationwide, here's what we see, to specific examples on the ground. Right. So that was, I thought that it worked. I don't know. I'm not the right person to ask. That's for readers to tell me. But that was the plan anyway. If you find it, it's like the big picture. And then how do we see that in actual individual lives? Yeah, it was great fun. Yes. She moves to New Hampshire with him. So, and both of them actually, it's a good question, because both Lucretia and Albert meet their eventual deaf spouse at the American school, which was pretty typical, right? As you'd probably imagine, right? So the other thing the schools did was it suddenly, you're not going to meet, you know, to your question about Nantucket and living here, you're not going to meet your spouse here, right? Like, especially here, you know, like it's not Martha's Vineyard, right? It's not Martha's Vineyard where you could still marry a hearing person because they'd be able to talk to you because they know sign language. It's Nantucket. They don't know how to do that. So you're not going to meet a spouse here. So going to school, suddenly there's all these other deaf people, right? And a lot of deaf people met and then eventually married through the school. So Lucretia marries a man named George Kent, and Albert marries Rhoda Edson. And Rhoda was actually kind of like Albert. So he, you know, just kept moving and getting jobs. She leaves, graduates from the American school, moves to Lowell, starts working in the factories, saving up money. So yeah, she was a bit of a self-starter like he was too, actually. Yeah. Yeah, there were clearly, yeah, there was clearly like a fairly, in the Northeast, there was clearly a pretty well-established deaf community in Boston. Yeah, you can really see numbers there. And again, it's not that surprising, right? It's an urban environment, you can all settle, right? You also see a fairly good number of deaf people in New Bedford in 1880. This was actually one of the surprising things in doing this book project. And most of them were working in the maritime industry, but like building ships, the ship's carpenters, again, with the skills they had learned at the American school. So you can see a little bit of that. Overall in 1880, there's a shocking number of deaf people who suddenly turn up out in the Midwest, and we have, for the life of us, did not actually figure out why. So we like do like a little shabba-dabba in the book, like, that's interesting, nothing to see here, right? Because we can't figure out why they were living there either. So I hope readers don't notice that we just kind of wandered away from that. Because it's before, the arrival of all these deaf people out there is before heavy industry arrives. Because that's, you know, where you first go. Well, they're mills, factories. No, those aren't there yet. Like, not in the 1880, like they're coming, but not there yet. So we were like, well, then why are they there? And we just kind of looked at each other and went, because others were there, I don't know, like, and they get pulled in, kind of by, hey, I'm here, it's cool, you should move here too. Your guess is good as mine right now, but yeah. Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yes, yes, that's actually what I'm now finding, as you can tell, really interesting about this group. They're small, but the individual stories they each of them have is really interesting in a deep way. And they are this great, like, untold story, right? Versus Martha's Vineyard, which talks about his deaf community a lot, right? Oh, boy. Wow. You are now asking. Okay, I will tell you this as the short answer. The short answer is sometimes. So what happens is I frequently will absolutely know for a fact, right, that this person is deaf because I'm looking at the enrollment records of the American school and they're a student and I know when they attended. And so I know this is a deaf person because they go to a deaf school, which is really helpful because then you turn to a census record and sometimes it says they're supposed to note that the person's deaf. It says there's a space on the form, especially in 1880, where they're supposed to check a box and go, yes, this person is deaf. And sometimes it is checked, and that's a good thing, but frequently it's not. And so I know this person's deaf, but anyone else looking at this form just thinks these are all hearing people. Yeah, so it becomes a challenge to doing the work that we were trying to do. And it's part of why we finally settled on the title of Ordinary Lives, because it's exactly finding these ordinary people that's such a challenge, because so many times you're staring, like literally you're staring at them on this census form in front of you and you have no idea you're looking at them. Yeah.
Yeah.
This was it. This was my last day here. End with a bang. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. A round of applause. There we go. Um,
Thank you. No, it happens. Yeah, no, it's,
sometimes we end up having like a festival weekend and it brings people in
because people then are like,
oh, what's over here? Oh, the store is open. Is this a museum? And they wander in and yeah, like we've gotten up to like 90 people, like where we have to turn people away because of fire code. And then there are other days where they just hide or but good questions, some intrigue. I'm blown away by that story of Albert. I mean,
oh my God, don't you, I want like
you
the
find out
Apple
more
TV Plus series, the whole thing.
about that, you gotta come back and just be like the grand reveal, like this is what he
Totally.
did, like found this log. Even in like, I was just thinking too, like with the maritime conditions, like, let's say you're a fisherman, you're not a whaler, it's not gonna be like you're wrestling a 70-ton behemoth in the water. But at the same time, like there's storms, there's like there's so much adversity, visibility can be low, it can be foggy, it can be hazy. Like how do you
And I get that he's the Cooper, which also is wild. Right?
Yeah.
Like, he's the guy like, if these barrels don't hold, we're fucked on this journey, right? Like, so his job is really important, right? It's hugely important. And he's like I don't understand like how he can't be carrying around a small slate like his sister on a whale ship. That doesn't make any sense to me.
No.
Does it?
Well,
I don't know.
I was
Maybe
wondering almost if sailors had like, what
is there
was
some like patois that they like looked at?
some sort of like signing or, like even if it was like touch based sign language or something where you could like draw. Because when I was at the Whaling Museum, we had guests come in, they asked for a special tour, and I said, okay, of course, like how can I help? And for the first time ever, I encountered somebody that relied on touch based sign language, where they're deaf
Mhm.
and they're blind,
Mhm.
and their family was there to translate, and it was
Right,
miraculous
we
to
hold
have
on to
them,
them
like,
and they,
yeah,
it's,
they were
it's
like
wise.
signing into his body,
Yeah.
and you know, I could see something like that
Yeah.
maybe.
Right,
Like, but I just, yeah, the slate, and that could not be a maritime solution at all, like.
you wouldn't think so, it didn't leap to me as the solution.
No,
Like, I know that deaf people were using that in his own.
and he was there for that whole
For
voyage.
4 years, the
So-
whole voyage.
He obviously was doing something right, and hopefully was in good health and had a successful time while he was out there.
Like, seriously, like, when I found this out, company, like, this guy was here. Yeah, I about this. Yeah. Perhaps I had read the other way, but.
You're not gonna find him, but, yeah, well, you don't wanna think that way, we should think of all the hurdles, like.
The notion that he would have joined.
There was
Plus,
a
it's like such an easy.
Yeah,
He's
yeah,
like
yeah.
every other, he's like a young guy,
Yeah.
20 years old.
I'm serious, actually.
19th century, he's like, I would join the ship to that everybody.
A book and it would be like, it's part of the culture, he's participating in that, he obviously has hurdles based on his
Such an
identity, and like, but is still nevertheless a Nantucketer, and like, rising above, like, I'm a whaler, look at me, I've been out this 4 years.
You
like,
got it.
Yeah.
So-
And like, I had to deal with all these annoying Assyrian people, that like, you know. But,
No, totally. I like,
so are you coming back to more, like, research, you think, or?
one is like mine, like that was on some, and. There it is. When I get back to my life. Well, I'm gonna- I don't want to.
That'll be,
Then, and it's like, yeah. So, like me, I have a. It's fun.
yeah, I know, work with people that have. Here's stories, like, stories that, obviously, they're, like, a deaf person, like, listen, they're seeing the story, and they're like, wow, that's me, like, the past, like, doing an amazing thing, like, you hear, I have an invisible disability with, like, learning disability on the autism spectrum, and, you know, like, you always do, you can't, and I imagine for a deaf person, that's even more so the case, and to have those examples, like, historical examples of people just being people, like, whether that's doing, like, whether it's gone for 4 years, or just like, okay, I'm going, like, going to the supermarket, it's not a whole ordeal, you know, like, examples of the vineyard and Albert, like, just.
There are other Nantucketers.
treatment like before, like all that. But yeah, but seriously, thank you so much for coming out here, like, and just hosting, like, and even just getting to talk with you here, like, I feel like, wow, I just got you here for me. Especially when I found out that there were major connections. Like, oh, look at me.
And I thought that was the big deal. But not that it's not, like that's a huge.
Yeah.
But that should sort of show off like why I want to make sure.
What if I put you on food? Like, I'm just trying to. Yeah. Maybe. Let's just do it grounding. Like, hey, I can say one word in Chinese and it sounds really cool. Like, I don't get that vibe.
Like totally separate from stuff. And so it's also connecting from the line of right, so this is
Things are different, and then say, oh, well, we've been in science, like, but, you know, the past is portrayed as cold and unfeeling, but there are these moments of warmth and community building that just relate through anyway.
great.
Yeah, so.
And inclusion.
Yeah.
Without people making like a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Like inclusion. Of course, they have to.
Yeah, that question, like, you're a Nantucketer, you're on the ship.
Right.
When you get that, definitely come back.
Okay.
And share it with us.
I will.
You're next. Yeah. Yeah. That's incredible. But seriously, thank you again so much. I hope that safe travels and everything. So you leave 1 o'clock. Okay, and where are you, they have you staying at 99 May?
Yes.
Okay, so definitely make sure you get down here at the parade. I don't know if they filled you in on how that is, but if you want to see the cars, there you have all the amazing cars from like Henry Ford Model T all the way up to like 1950s, like 60s, 70s.
So all just like hang out with them?
They hang out on Main Street and then they rev up their engines and go on a journey. So
I should like get them there tomorrow.
yeah, go and take pictures, like, selfies, girl, you're on Nantucket. Yeah. Just get a flower, put it in your hair. Thank you so much.